what a utility should do when they get the results of a test back and it indicates that the test failed.
One, somebody needs to be minding the store, right? Somebody needs to be looking at those test and maintenance reports who can interpret them, who can see, hey, this assembly failed or this assembly passed. And when you get that test report in, communication with your testers is very important.
What are the most common reasons that failed tests or overdue sites remain unresolved?
From my experience, they're very diligent. They have a labor force. They've got every piece they have in place, but their current software didn't tell them or didn't bring back up if something was more than 90 days overdue.
What separates a program at a utility where they just send reminders versus a more comprehensive or complete program? Welcome to FLO Talk, a conversation with water professionals. I'm Joel Klumpp, and today we're changing things up a little. I've taken Travis's usual seat as the host, and he's moving to the guest chair so that we can put his experience to work. Before we get started, I wanted to remind our audience of the TCEQ Public Drinking Water Conference, which will be August 4th and 5th. HAC will have a booth at that conference, booth number 11. So if you hear anything in this conversation that you'd like to learn more about, please come by booth 11 and speak to an HAC representative. All right, let's get started. Travis has spent years working directly with utilities, inspectors, and backflow testers. So today, I'll be asking the questions and letting him do most of the talking. Today, we're combining Pillar 4, backflow prevention assembly testing, and Pillar 5, remediation. Testing is the part of a cross-connection control program most utilities are familiar with. Assemblies have due dates, test reports get submitted, and notices are sent when testing is coming due or becomes overdue. But sending notices is not the same as resolving non-compliance. The real challenge begins when an assembly fails its test, a customer doesn't respond to a notice, or a site remains overdue after multiple notices are sent. Is there a clear next step? Is someone assigned to it? Is there a deadline? Can the utility show what happened from the first notice through the final resolution? To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined by Travis Kvaal, Cross-Connection Control Field Operations Supervisor with Hardin Associates Consulting and Partnership Development Lead for FLO by HAC. Travis, welcome to the other side of the microphone.
Thanks, man.
All right. Before we get started, can you tell us some about your background, specifically what you've learned working directly with utilities, inspectors, and backflow testers?
Yeah, like you said, my name is Travis Kvaal. I've been in water and wastewater for about 25 years now. It's been a long time. And cross-connection control, specialized there a little over 15 years ago. I spent a good amount of time in my early 20s not having any clue what a backflow assembly was. And certainly been a fun ride since I learned. But we ran cross-connection control programs in some North Texas municipalities and gained quite a bit of knowledge there. And then through the education of groups like your cross-connection control subcommittee, we're able to pick up quite a few things. And about 3 years ago now, I moved over to Hardin Associates. And since that time, it's just been an explosion of both experience and knowledge gained from water purveyors all over the state of Texas as they begin their cross-connection control programs or try to fix cross-connection control programs that have maybe fallen a little behind. And it's really been a pleasure, really the favorite work of my lifetime to be able to plug in and work with those folks who are trying to get their hands around this issue.
Great. Well, based on your experience, we're definitely in good hands to talk about these two topics today. I want to talk about testing of backflow prevention assemblies as the starting point of a cross-connection control program. Now, most utilities have a process for tracking when a particular backflow prevention assembly is due to be tested. But if you could talk for a little bit about what separates a program at a utility where they just send reminders versus a more comprehensive or complete program?
Yeah, absolutely. So I began my program, my first cross connection control program, as a spreadsheet warrior. And I've met a lot of these spreadsheet warriors over the years, meaning I had a list of backflow preventers. Maybe I even had hazard types, right? Health or non health. And I had a due date, right? And then it was my job to produce notices and send those notices out to customers and hopefully get backflow tests back and test and maintenance reports back in return. And that worked sometimes, and it didn't work sometimes. But what I didn't know really was, holistically, how many assemblies I had in my system. If I didn't get a chance to do the customer service inspection there, I didn't have a great grasp of why hazard classes were classed the way they were, or what some of those processes served were, and also if you just have a due date and you get that test back on a spreadsheet, it's really hard to keep track of once you get any volume at all, right? When you've got 50 assemblies in your water system, it can be fairly simple. But when you expand into the thousands of assemblies, it can get really hard. And so maybe you send out your first notice and you send out your second notice. And even with the tracking software, something that we've learned is those automated notices are triggered off of due dates, right? And so they'll send a first notice and send a second notice. But what happens if a test isn't performed that year? Next year is a notice send out. Is the 2 or 3 years from now is a notice sent out. And so things fall through the cracks, and it's really easy to happen, whether you're a spreadsheet warrior or you're on one of these softwares. And so it really takes either a really modern software that's looking for those things, like we've developed with FLO, or just an incredible amount of manpower to be able to search through kind of hard to parse data to see if you're having things fall through the cracks.
Definitely. And I'll ask you here in a little bit about the FLO software that HAC has developed and how that can do so much more than just help a utility with those notices. But just to make sure the audience understands what problems can arise for a utility that's relying on a spreadsheet or some other program where those notices are getting sent, but they don't have some type of additional mechanism for addressing non-compliance if customers aren't responding to those notices.
Yeah, a notice is a piece of paper, right? And so we need in our service agreements or our ordinances some sort of enforcement backing. And then we need to be willing to use those things, those tools in our toolbox to make sure folks are compliant. And we never like to enforce or give any of our customers bad news, right? They're our water customers. We want to make them happy. But we do have a responsibility to protect the quality of water for our entire water system, for all of our water customers. And so, one, it can't just be all of these notices are due in February and all of these notices are due in March, and I'm going to send these notices out in February and send these notices in March. It has to be what actually came back in from those notices. What are my health hazards that have to be tested on an annual basis that I have no real choice about? And then can I compare and contrast those things easily? And then beyond that, for folks who do have health hazard assemblies, when they choose not to test or when they ignore their notices, what's my communication or education path for those customers to get them back into compliance?
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk. So we've been talking about customers who might not respond to a notice, but let's also talk a little bit about customers who are having a backflow prevention assembly tester come and the results of that test are a failure. Can you talk a little bit about what a utility should do when they get the results of the test back and it indicates that the test failed?
Yeah, absolutely. One, somebody needs to be minding the store, right? Somebody needs to be looking at those test and maintenance reports who can interpret them, right? Who can see, hey, this assembly failed or this assembly passed. And when you get that test report in, communication with your testers is very important, right? There's a lot of places that in their ordinance, a tester might have 10 days to turn in a test report. And so if you get that test report on a health hazard and it failed 10 days ago, you've got an alarm bell ringing. And so what you want to do is have good communication with your testers where they know, hey, if I've got a test that fails on a health hazard, I want to know about it right now, immediately. And then what we want to do then is really get into consumer education, right? If that customer is not apt to get that repaired and retested immediately, I want to, as a program administrator, educate that customer on the importance of that, right? And then if education doesn't work, then we move to enforcement. But that really requires communications with the tester. And then also, if it gets into your software as failing, you didn't have that communication with the tester. Is there any alarm bells ringing in your software, or does it just say, hey, a test came in, it's due next year?
Yeah. We were talking a little bit about this before we started the podcast.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the distinction between having a backflow prevention assembly, both at the meter and then also an adequate internal program.
Yeah.
In the event that a backflow prevention assembly fails its test, can you talk a little bit in greater detail about how that's impacted based on whether or not it's the assembly installed at the meter versus an internal assembly, and how those two things interact?
Yeah, for me, it's the hazard level, right? Whether it's internal or containment at the meter. But I will say one thing that we used to do in the programs that I ran is when we had the opportunity, when there was real health hazards inside a facility, sometimes we would require point of use isolation at that hazard and also containment. And require may be too strong of a word. Recommend is really more what I mean. And we would educate those customers at that time. I know this is an initial expense, but at the point that you have an assembly fail, either at point of use or containment, if that point of use assembly fails, we can tell you, hey, let's hold off using potable water inside the facility for our folks, but our potable water system is protected by that containment. So you can still use water for your process. Or if that containment assembly failed, but my point of use assembly is passing, that gives me a little wiggle room to say, hey, go ahead and get that containment assembly repaired and retested, but I have no reason to turn your water off because we're all still protected. And so using common sense and also having that protection, both point of use and containment, can be really helpful for water systems in those health hazard situations.
That's an excellent point, that kind of belt and suspenders approach of both containment and point of use, and how, as a utility, it can be difficult to require both. But that, again, the importance of customer education that you've talked about a couple times here, so that the customer understands that that could impact their ability to maintain operations in the event of a test failure. And then, of course, part of that customer education is also explaining to them, hey, you want your customers at your facility, your staff, anybody
Absolutely.
drinking water there, to be protected, not just the people out in the distribution system. So, yeah, excellent points there, Travis. All right, from your field experience, what are the most common reasons that failed tests or overdue sites remain unresolved?
Yeah, so from my experience, and we just went through this with a program that I'm very familiar with. They're very diligent. They have a labor force. They've got great ordinances. They've got every piece they have in place. But their current software didn't tell them if something was, or didn't bring back up if something was more than 90 days overdue. And so when we moved them over, they were shocked at their compliance percentage. and it's because those things that fall through the cracks. But the other thing is, that's a system that has manpower that's doing a great job, that is really working hard. There's a lot of water systems out there, as you know, Joel, that just don't have that support or manpower for their cross connection control program. So if all you have is a spreadsheet and maybe an administrator that's wearing many hats, it can be very, very difficult to stay on top of it. And so you're just going to lose things, not necessarily test and maintenance reports, but track of dates and compliance rates. And so it's very important that whatever your manpower ability, right, whatever your council allocates, or your I'm losing the word for muds and suds with the group that makes those decisions, the board, whatever your board decides to allocate for cross connection control, that you give that group the tools they need to be able to stay on top of everything.
Definitely. Well, let's take a minute for our audience and walk through what typically happens. So a property owner receives a notice before the assembly is due for testing. And then if the test isn't completed, a second notice is sent, the past due notice. Mm-hmm. And then in many platforms, like you've mentioned, this is where the automated process stops. And so then from that point forward, utility staff may have to move the issue into like a work order system, or maybe maintain a separate spreadsheet or some other type of manual follow-up process. And that's kind of what we've been talking about so far. Do you have anything to add about how those cases can get lost in situations where the software doesn't specifically take the utility personnel to that next step of trying to resolve that non-compliance?
Yeah, it's simple, right? If any information you have to go dig for, if you're busy, you're not going to dig for, right? And I think you and I both know cross connection control personnel, whether they're dedicated staff or whether they're, utility supervisor or crew leader or admin staff that has it piled on to their workload, they're busy folks. And so those things get lost. And you're right, that enforcement piece or the education piece is incredibly important. And that's one thing that I want to stress as well. I know I've talked about education several times, but the more education you do, the less enforcement you have to do. And I know that's a little off topic for this question, but I would say, right after that non-compliance notice goes out, when you have a customer that's unresponsive, your first course of action should really be education. Why do you have this assembly? Why is it a health hazard? Why is it necessary to be tested on an annual basis? And education, not just on regulation, but actually the hazards associated with the assembly, so that it's not government red tape to them anymore. It's protecting their neighbor or protecting the folks inside their own facility, like you were talking about.
Yeah. And, hopefully that would be all it would take to get customers to understand how staying on top of that is protecting themselves and others. But we all know that there will be cases where that isn't enough to get compliance. So you had mentioned FLO, the software developed by HAC. Can you talk some more about FLO and specifically the resolution center, which would then be part of the process for any utility using that software where the notices haven't achieved the desired effect?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've talked about sometimes customers choose not to get testing done, right? And so a couple of the things we do in FLO is, one, for your utility staff, we never let you forget about a CSI that hasn't been done or a backflow test that hasn't been done that's required. So that stays in that resolution center until an employee goes and cleans it out, or until it's assigned to an employee to go take action for it. So it encourages you to do enforcement. Some of the other softwares that we've run into over the years almost encourage through not showing you all that you have outstanding in action, right? They just show you what is coming in. They don't necessarily show you what's not coming in. And it's easy to have a little complacency set in there. The Resolution Center, we want to show you everything. We want to show you the real health of your program because we're a compliance company, right? With a compliance aim. And so we do that there. And we also make it very simple from there to do something like a cleanup notice where, hey, I'm going to send a notice to everybody in my system who's overdue, whether they're 3 months overdue or 2 years overdue. And so the things that have maybe fallen through the cracks, the restaurant manager that changed after they got 2 notices and the new manager never saw it. Right. Well, guess what? You're going to see it again. And it also always gives me a working list for when I want to do face-to-face. And I can assign 2 individual inspectors or individual folks to go do that outreach and customer education. And it also is buildable for your workflow, right? What is your system of enforcement or education? And then how can we get things plugged in that in a way that reminds you to take those steps so that you never lose those things through the cracks? And then also just a modern dashboard that shows you the real rates of your system, right? What's compliant, what's overdue, and that you can break down in multiple ways. Because we have a lot of municipalities and water systems that don't just test health hazards like the TCEQ requires, right? So we want you to be able to, when it comes time for your investigation, to pare down, hey, what's a health hazard? What am I required in my ordinance to have tested on an annual basis? Can I filter that out quickly? Can I prepare my data quickly for that investigator?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that really stuck out to me about the way you were explaining FLO's Resolution Center is acknowledging that one water system or one utility might have a very different process for dealing with non-compliance than another, and that the FLO Resolution Center allows that utility to tailor that so that if addressing non-compliance for them means turning something over to their building inspection department, or it means coordinating with another department to potentially assess a fee, or reaching out to the customer and talking about kind of the nuclear option, potentially needing to terminate water service if the customer continues to be non-compliant. So the fact that FLO is adaptable enough to be able to accommodate the specific procedures for an individual utility sounds like an incredible tool that can be individual for the water system.
Yeah, and ultimately what that is the folks that spent their time banging their head against the wall trying to have compliant programs had a chance to design this program. And we found it to be really beneficial, and we've reached out to a lot of the folks who have had similar challenges to figure out, how do we cover all the bases and all the different ordinances and all the different tariffs and the different ways that communities deal with their water customers and still provide a helpful tool across those things.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the documentation needed when working with the FLO Resolution Center to ensure that whether it's internal for the utility or perhaps it's during a compliance inspection when TCEQ, when a regional investigator is evaluating a utility's cross-connection control program. If someone with the utility is reviewing a non-compliant account months after the non-compliance occurred, what are the important parts of the record? What documentation should be present for that staff member to be able to look at to explain to his or her boss or to the TCEQ investigator what the actions taken had been?
Yeah. So one, you want the basics, right? I want the customer service inspection that was done on that facility, so that I know the hazard level and the different hazards that might be presented. I want the backflow assemblies and the backflow assembly test reports that have been completed at that location, and an understanding of the hazard level of each one of those individual connections. From there, I want to know every notice that's been sent out, right? I want to know what notice was sent out, when it was sent out, and I want to have records of those things. I also want to be able to record, hey, I had a phone call with this customer at this date and time, and this is what we talked about. Or I had an in-person meeting with this customer at this date and time, and this is what we talked about. And these things you might get off the test report, but the tester of record at that facility, who was the last tester that went and touched those assemblies. And if I have those things, I have a pretty good picture of what's going on at that facility.
Yeah, definitely. I would just add that hopefully in those cases, there would also be documentation of the final resolution. Assuming that the process, worked the way it should, nothing fell through the cracks, and ultimately that customer got to the point where what needed to be done was achieved.
Yes, absolutely. And to be honest, as you asked that question, I'm putting together the documentation I need if I need to pass it along for those fines or enforcement that you talked about. But yes, in FLO or anywhere you want the ultimate goal is to get those assemblies tested or get that customer service inspection completed. And so, yeah, a completed test report or customer service inspection is gold in that case.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that was really the last question that I had planned to ask you was, if somebody asks the utility cross-connection control program manager, hey, what happened at this particular site after it became non-compliant? I think you just very succinctly spelled out all of the documentation that you would want to be able to look to be able to explain the situation. And then again, hopefully be able to show compliance at the end of the process. So Travis, thank you for sharing your experience today and for letting me take over your seat. The main takeaway that I have from this conversation is that testing and the remediation need to work together, whether it's the remediation of an assembly that fails the test or in the case where a customer isn't responding to a notice. Testing tells the utility whether an assembly passed, failed, or became overdue. Remediation makes sure the issue doesn't stop at a notice. It creates ownership, deadlines, documentation, escalation, and a clear path to verified resolution. And that connection is central to how FLO by HAC was developed. As you talked about, FLO supports testing notifications, and through the Resolution Center, it helps utility managers manage and document what happens next. Again, a reminder to our audience that if you'd like to learn more about FLO or any of the other services provided by HAC, come by the TCEQ PDW conference on August 4th and 5th and talk to somebody at the HAWK, the HAC booth, booth number 11. And then lastly, a strong program should be able to answer 3 questions without digging through spreadsheets. Which sites are non-compliant? Who owns the next step? And what is being done to resolve any issues? Thanks for listening to FLO Talk, a conversation with water professionals. We'll see you next time.